Hi, everyone. This is Jason Barrack of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest. He's joining us from Costa Rica. He's editor of the Hat Trick Letter found at goldenjackass.com. Jim Willie, thank you for joining me again.
Oh, good to be on. And finally, we're pretty much done with the summer. And now I think we have some actual fireworks and breakdowns to look forward to. And I don't mean several months away. I think the indications from some of the sourced information that I'm getting is that we're looking toward a breakdown in a matter of weeks, and we don't know where it's going to come from. But here's one indication I got, Jason. This is very fresh, and it was confirmed. London Paul gave the information, shared it to our little group of colleagues with the Golden Jackass, the Hat Trick Letter group. Of my friends and trusted colleagues, but it was also confirmed by Cato, who has connections with U.S. government high-level security groups. And what I'm hearing is that there have been approximately 8 banking system and bond system overnight failures since mid or early July. 8 failures for banks and bonds. And they were all patched up at the cost of many, many billions of dollars on each event by narco money. And the 4 big banks that provided information to London Paul, all 4 sources at the 4 Wall Street banks said that there is absolutely no way we make it to January without a big failure like Lehman. And I think if we have any failure like Lehman, it's going to be more than 1 or 2 banks. So systemic failure, I call it a systemic Lehman event. That's what I've been calling it for a few months, because they lashed themselves together to share the risk after Lehman in 2009. So that if anyone goes down, a group goes down. And if a group goes down, before you know it, multiple nations are having trouble. So that's why I keep a special eye on Deutsche Bank, the German banks, and all the Italian banking system.
The 2 big to fail banks, Jim, after 2008, none of the problems were solved with them, and they just kept getting larger and larger. They did even more credit bubbles. I've heard stories about them exploding the commercial real estate lending because of Dodd-Frank. It created this unintended consequence of Dodd-Frank. Oh, we're going to regulate them more, the banks will be fine. Well, the banks, instead of giving out small business loans to people on Main Street to grow their businesses and actually create jobs, they started giving out more loans to commercial real estate builders to build speculative commercial real estate buildings that are not being leased or being offered at a discount, and people are going bankrupt there. So is that why you think then that the U.S. dollar, U.S. Treasury market, and the global economy are headed for a major crisis in the next 2 to 3 months?
Oh, I think the main reason is that QE, the African-style monetary hyperinflation that we have in place, it has run its course, and now you're starting to get the horrendous feedback loops from having destroyed the sovereign bond markets. They've destroyed the sovereign bond markets, and now they're looking to do the same to the corporate bond market, which they will also destroy. Now, we're talking about feedback loop. This is a very interesting point. I don't think any major economists in the West have a grip on the feedback loop concept. What happens to the Treasury bond market after 4 or 5 years where the Fed is the main buyer, the buyer of last resort? What happens to the integrity of the market? What happens to the legitimate buyers? What happens to all the different cable lines, the derivative connections, linking currencies to bonds, linking banking functions to bonds? They all get undermined, they all get weakened, they all get destroyed. So now we're starting to see tremendous cracks in the Treasury bond market. For instance, back in December, there was supposedly an interest rate hike of 0.25%. We didn't really have an interest rate hike of 0.25%. What we had was a relaxation of the reverse repo. What they did was they took cash from the big Wall Street banks, gave them treasury bonds, which they could better and more effectively leverage than cash. So the Treasury bond tower of Babel is higher and the footprint is smaller because they're using more leverage and reducing their cash. They can't leverage off cash at the Wall Street Bank. So imagine a Sears tower that used to be 110 stories high. Well, now its base is only 2/3 of the original size base, the footprint, but it's now 200 stories high. It's less stable. So these are feedback effects of QE itself. And in the meantime, you have nation after nation dumping their treasury bonds because, first of all, they're supposedly worth more. They fetch more in the market. But secondly, they notice that the Fed is not just doing what they claim to be doing. They've exported to the BRICS nation of Belgium, Luxembourg, Ireland, Cayman, and Switzerland. So they've doubled the amount of QE volume. So everything about QE is a lie. And I have a saying, Jason, it's very simple. QE was meant to save the too big to fail banks. They all went insolvent. So QE was a liquidity device to prevent insolvent banks from entering failure due to lack of liquidity. It's not a stimulus. It was a big bank failure preventative device. But by saving the big banks, they've killed the economy because, like we learned in actual economics classes in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, hyperinflation kills capital. And they call it stimulus. It's not stimulative to capital. Where's the capital formation with the hyperinflation? No, it's all to cover the bonds, the impaired bonds. So the Wall Street banks didn't fail simply because QE happened. They all would have failed, but they're also relying on very heavy narco money movement and cuts. So I think we're starting to see a number of bond market failures that are done quietly. I think we've got some dead bond primary dealers who are being propped up. So they're really zombie dealers. Their movements are all controlled by the Fed. Arms and legs move by, strings. A lot of the inner workings. I just had a long conversation with a fellow about this early this morning. All the things that are connected to the bond market are now broken because of QE. QE undermines the integrity. It's like, all right, you've got a human body and the arms and legs are not permitted to move, but a machine will move them without the internal exertion from the muscles. So you get a leg moved by some strings and cables. Well, you don't get a strong heart from that, and you don't get a strong circulatory system. You don't get good capillary action. You don't get good muscle reconstruction the night after. So you get atrophy of the entire leg and the heart due to the artificial movement of the leg. And that's what QE is, artificial movement. The good buyers, the legitimate buyers, sell out. Oh, we got an idiot moron agency window that's buying up all the worthless treasuries at propped up prices. Let's sell. Let's get out because we're a well-run organization. Let's get out. Okay, they've created a black hole, simply stated. The treasury bond is a black hole. It's attracting capital from around the world. It's also funded and generated. The whole vortex is pushed by QE. Since when can we act like Zimbabwe among the Western central banks and get away without systemic damage? Okay, so it's all breaking.
Jim, the U.S. seems to be able to have gotten away with it for a lot longer than most people think because most of the dollars have been either exported outside the United States to other countries who either hold them or it creates inflation in those economies, or it's gone into asset prices, propping up these artificial bubbles or creating new credit bubbles. So I think that's one of the ways. We are in dystopian territory, though, about the global economy. We have greater than 180 billion per month in collective global quantitative easing already. We're at negative interest rates on government bonds. We have negative interest rates being talked about for depositors at banks.
Well, then we're not getting away with it. You're defining how we're not getting away with it. We're talking about a wrecked system. We're not getting away with it. We've wrecked the system. We have an export now of 500,000 empty containers in our shipping ports out of the United States in 2015. We're not getting away with it. We got an economy that's stuck in a 4% recession or worse every year since 2008. We're not getting away with it. Okay, you got asset prices going up. That doesn't mean we got away with it. We got unemployment that's over 24%. We're not getting away with it. We're managing the decline into the sewer drain, and it's the global economy. I dispute heavily that we've gotten away with it. We have a ruined bond market. We got a prop stock market. We got the Federal Reserve that's investing heavily in stocks that's not legal, not under contract. Now they want to invest in corporate bonds. That's not legal, not under corporate contract. I question whether the Federal Reserve itself even has a contract that's active anymore. We're not getting away with it. We're managing the wreckage and ruin of the nation's economy and financial structures. QE is nothing more than a fail-safe system that's temporary and has been expended for many, many years. Japan never got out of their 1991 problem with QE and 0%, yet we imitated them. It tells me that we're absolutely desperate to avoid a government debt default, which I believe also happened recently. U.S. government debt default. I believe it's happened.
Now, Jim, I want to talk about the next global financial system. Why do you think China is pushing for an SDR-backed bond? Is it because the RMB is about to go into the SDR basket?
Well, yeah, I think this is basically an intermediary device by China. They want more global usage of the RMB bond. RMB being renminbi, which means people's money. It's synonymous. It's not exactly the same. I've heard some distinction from some Chinese clients. They say the yuan is the currency inside China. The RMB is a currency that's passed around internationally. Okay, well, aren't they exchangeable once they pass the border? And they say, no, it's not that simple. It might be for the dollar. It's not like that. Anyway, they want more international usage of the RMB. I believe it has something like only 6% usage in international bond reserve banking systems and only about 2.5% usage in international trade payment systems. It doesn't have a critical mass of usage internationally. I mean, it used to be an argument a year ago that they didn't have an international capital account to allow for a lot of, say, an investment across the world from domestic Chinese money and make it instantly redeemable, say, versus a Colombian peso. So it wasn't so widely used, and now they've got a device. It's going to be the IMF special drawing right platform. It's going to allow and enable a lot more RMB bonds to be purchased and passed around. That's what the Chinese want. They want more infiltration, if you will. It's a nasty word on implication, but they want to integrate more the Chinese currency in the major platforms like the banking systems and trade payment systems. I took a close look at the ratios before and after inclusion of the RMB at the IMF for the currency weights, going from 4 currency to 5. The dollar, euro, pound, and yen now has a fifth. And the biggest loss is 8% from the euro and 3% from the British pound to allow for the almost 11% for the RMB. So you're going to see a lot of swapping of euro bonds for RMB bonds. You're not going to see treasury bonds dumped. They were very careful. The change is under 1% before and after on the US dollar regarding the IMF basket. So, you know, this is going to be quite interesting. I think we have another funny event coming up with respect to the RMB and its wide usage. Aramco, the Saudi giant oil and petrochemical complex firm, I think they're selling 10% of their equity, and look for China to buy it. And if indeed China buys a significant stake like that, I mean, it might not sound like much, but gosh, I don't have the exact figure, Jason, but I believe 10% of Aramco is $100 billion. Okay, I don't have the exact figures. So we're talking about a large amount of money, but not a very large percentage for the Aramco ownership. Here's my call. If China buys a big equity stake in Aramco, the Saudis will be selling oil to China and accepting RMB. Why would China expect otherwise? They're part owner, so they're going to want their product that they own 10% of to be payable in RMB. And I think that's a very natural thing to come. But that's going to further along the final nails to the coffin on the petrodollar itself. So I think they're just looking to see how can they bring about more usage of the RMB internationally, wherever, whether it's trade or banking, wherever. I think the big event with respect to China is going to be the announcement of their gold-backed RMB currency, which, by the way, I heard was pre-announced by the Chinese in March last March, I should say, March of 2016. They announced that they were going to be producing a gold-backed yuan currency. And the United States said, oh, no, you don't. You do that, and we got a world war. We got a war directly with you, and it's going to be a conflagration. So China basically said, okay, we'll back off, but we'll wait for your dollar and bond system to fracture. Because, as they said, they didn't think it was going to last till the end of the year. Not that they were going to sabotage it, but it's going to die on its own weight of debt and crumbling cables for everything connected to the Treasury bond complex. This is a very important point. The QE has wrecked everything connecting to the Treasury bond market. That's the big event coming up with respect to the Chinese currency. This IMF, oh gosh, I think the IMF SCR basket is going to be a non-solution which will be recommended. Now remember the von Mises sound money principles. You cannot replace a broken paper currency system with any other type of paper currency system. So you can't patch together 4 broken paper currencies, put on a fifth, even if it does have a bigger industrial base like in China, and expect it to be a successful paper-backed basket that serves as a basis foundation. It won't work. Now, it could be that the Chinese are going to tell the Americans and the British and the Western Europeans, hey, you know, we'll go along with your idea here. But it's mainly with a hidden motive to pass around and circulate and use more of their RMB currency before the system breaks. So it's like they'll have lots and lots of RMB seeds around the world in the financial and commercial platforms for when they actually have a gold-backed currency, the RMB. I think we're going to see a simultaneous RMB gold-backed currency and gold trade notes used for trade payments. Jason, I'd like to share with you a quick story, if I could, about rejection of the Treasury bills at port facilities.
Sure, no problem. Let's hear it.
Okay, I got an email from a client because I've been making the point that the shipping distress, the shipping conflicts that we've been hearing about are not so much about dock worker strikes. That's really not the issue. That's the false story. So they have big queues lined up with 30 ships that aren't unloading. at say Long Beach or Oakland, California. And there's a big problem there, but we're told that it's dock worker strikes, it's worker safety conditions, it's pay scales, it's reduced shipping loads causing problems with the workers with respect to their salaries, pay scales. Okay, the real story is the Treasury bills being rejected. And I got some clients that say, well, Jim, you know, if a ship leaves a port in China, or leaves a port in South Korea, or leaves a port in Indonesia or Taiwan, it knows exactly how its payment's going to be when it arrives 2 to 3 or 4 weeks later. To that I say, bullshit. You mean the American commercial and financial leaders never lie? Of course they lie. Maybe they tell them, no, don't worry, we've got some payments that are just as good as treasury bonds. You'll just love them. And they get here and they say, no, we couldn't work it out. You got treasury bills or nothing. And the ship owners say, okay, we're not unloading. You lied to us. Are you telling me that a lie is not a favorite tactic in the global financial war to defend the dollar? No, lie, fraud, bribery, murder, and war. Okay, so here's the story. Bobcat Corporation. They make warehouse forklifts and small construction trench scooper equipment, you know, like small Caterpillar equipment. Okay, they are South Korea parent owned, and they ship their product of machinery to the California and West Coast ports, and they are refusing treasury bills. It's causing a massive problem for the company. They want to unload, and they can't get proper payment. Why would they refuse treasury bills? Because we're printing them. This is part of the feedback loop for QE. QE started 2012. This is the 5th year of it. It's causing feedback problems called rejection. Why would they reject a treasury bill? Because the printing of it in hypermonetary inflation style is what Zimbabwe does. And we're doing it. So we're turning quickly into a financial third world nation where our ports are being blocked because we can't pay them with proper money. And we're shipping out 500,000 empty containers per year. It's an imbalance that will not continue. Why wouldn't it continue? Because we're printing money and they don't want it anymore. They don't think it has any value. I mean, I love the quote by Bernanke. He says, we have an electronic device that allows us to create money at no cost. No, you have an electronic device that allows you to print stuff, which you call money, that has no value. This is the feedback loop, the breakdown. I reason, Jason, if we hear one story about Bobcat, there are 20 others you haven't heard about.
Yeah, Jim, and the global economy, I mean, there's so many news stories on Zero Hedge. It just seems like one giant economic minefield. There's just so many. Either the mines are right at the surface and they're kind of obvious where we can see them, like the European banking system or the sovereign bond markets, or there's, mines that are hidden about a couple inches below the surface that we can't even detect. But it all seems to me like one giant fustercluck.
Yeah, I maintain that the minefield is the U.S. Treasury bond market. The evidence that it's a minefield is that it is now an active, very powerful black hole. The vortex is turning. It's powerful. And there are a number. Okay, take for instance, I've got a client in Brazil. I asked him, why is it that some of the wealthy and other financial firms in Brazil are investing in the Treasury bond when it has so much problems and we have active QE turning the vortex? And he said, because it's going up in value. Not because it's worth something. It's not worth anything. It's going up in value, but worthless. It reminds me of, I've said this now in the last few interviews. When I first got here, I didn't know how to say certain things, and I'd go to a cash register and I asked my buddy Carlos, how do you say, what does that cost? And he'd say, quanto vale? I said, wait a minute, isn't that what it's worth? And he said, yeah, same thing. I said, no, it's not. And he said, well, it works for here. Just ask her quanto vale. Well, later I started asking quanto cuesta. What does it cost? What does it cost and what is it worth? Very different things.
Yeah, I agree, Jim. When I learned what the global economy really was, how other countries could work their butts off to produce, goods and services and send them to the U.S., and all we have to do is just print more dollars and send the dollars back to them in exchange for it without, producing any goods or services. I realized, that eventually this Ponzi scheme that was the global economy was going to collapse at some point, that it wasn't sustainable.
It's exactly what it is. It's a Ponzi scheme. And I mean, the detractors who say, no, you don't understand Keynesian economics. They say, no, those people, those agents and entities in foreign lands that accept our treasury bonds, it doesn't matter where they come from because they're valid money. They can put them in their banking systems. But when they read year after year of not just quantitative easing, which is the hyper monetary inflation, but they read about bond fraud in the Wall Street banks that's not properly prosecuted. And then they read about how part of the government deficit for the United States is to support $600 to $700 billion worth of military defense budgets, and they're being attacked on their borders and internally from NGO groups. They start to think, we don't want to be part of this dollar system anymore. And that's when you get the de-dollarization, and that's when you get them under sanctions against the U.S. banking system platforms like SWIFT. And, the retaliation, like you were saying earlier before we recorded, is now you're seeing some of the Eastern entities hacking into the SWIFT, the Society of Worldwide Financial Transaction Systems. They're hacking into the systems and, bringing about false transactions and stealing information. They're undermining now the SWIFT platform, which is responsible for transactions. Before you know it, you're going to see a lot of countries, including in the West, saying, we don't trust the SWIFT system with some of our sensitive information on bank data. We're going to use Chinese interbank payment system, the CIPS. And you're going to see a lot of competition the next year with the Chinese. It's the SWIFT alternative.
Before we speak about gold, I want to ask your opinion on the European banking system. It seems like Europe is in the middle of a widespread banking system crisis over there. Do you think Deutsche Bank will be nationalized soon? And what about the other European banks? Who will bail them out?
This is a really delicate question. The Germans are caught in a bind, from what I understand. Okay, it started, Deutsche Bank is not the only problem they have. They've got some banks there that are in deep, deep trouble, not from the energy sector, but from the shipping sector. And Bremen Landesbank is one in focus. Okay. The Germans would like to do a national bailout, but instead what they might try to do is something clever, a finesse move, where they just say, well, we got these 5 banks. We want to fix these 5 banks. It's not a national bailout. It's just these 5 banks. But then the critics in Italy will say, but wait a minute, those 5 banks make up 80% of your banking system. Because the issue is the EU rule. If they do a national bailout, across the board fix of the system with a massive infusion of capital, regardless of whether it's phony capital or not, if they do a massive system-wide fix, they must do individual account bail-ins, confiscation of individual accounts. I don't know whether it's 30% or 100%. In Italy, they're doing a number of 100% confiscations in Italy. So Italy is saying, let's watch the Germans, because whatever they do for their system, we want to do to our system. And we know Germany does not want to kick into place the EU rule that forces in the individual account bail-in confiscation. So we want to do whatever the Germans do with all their clever language to sidestep this nasty bail-in. And it looks to us like the Germans want us to bail in our accounts in Italy. So there's a big battle going on. The Italian banking system is a total mess. They've got 360 billion euros of non-performing loans. I wouldn't be surprised if Germany has a nearly equal amount, but they just don't publicize the figures as well. What they do publicize in Germany is the $75 trillion of derivative exposure that just Deutsche Bank has. Okay, the banks in trouble in Germany include Bremen Landesbank, which is not real big, but Commerzbank is, and now Commerzbank is being discussed as part of a merger of two dead elements, Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank. Gosh, isn't that an American Economics 101, Finance 101 principle? You have some dead entities, merge them. What's the advantage of merging two dead entities? I don't know. I don't see any advantage whatsoever. It might spark a shareholder rally from the morons out there who think it's positive. And there are lots and lots of morons out there. So when it comes to the European banking system, I think we have some very big fireworks coming up. And one of the big issues here with respect to European banks is something that's not really talked about much, but the sharp folks at Zero Hedge do talk about it. And it is the fact that the banking system, the individual banks, have a tremendous amount of exposure to their own sovereign bond, their government bond. Then the government guarantees the sovereign bond, which essentially guarantees the private bank that owns these sovereign bonds. It's a vicious circle, and the percentages are rising within the PIGS nations of Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. The ratio is rising for this incestuous ratio. If the ratio gets too big, then the banks are the government because they own the government debt and they're guaranteed by the government. So they must be bailed out. You can't do the bailout unless you do the bail-ins of private accounts. It's a very messy, convoluted situation that Mario Draghi has encouraged. He's another architect of failure. He's the, I call him Prince Draghi, the Goldman Sachs animal. He's in charge of the European Central Bank. He's done nothing positive toward remedy and solution. He's made some arch enemies at the Bundesbank, Central Bank of Germany. The Bundesbank is basically bent over and said, all right, do whatever you got to do. But I think Germany is waiting in the wings here with a gold-backed Deutschmark. Everybody who's powerful in Europe understands that this system is breaking, so they're making preparation. The Swiss are preparing a gold-backed franc. And I'm hearing indications that the Brexit vote was permitted for them to leave so that the British, with all their London center power, will be in a position to launch a gold-backed currency, gold-backed British pound, and not be left out. This is not just about the British wanting to become a primary financial center for Eastern nations and Eastern powers. They want to be an RMB hub center for bonds and currency trading, to be sure. But the British want to be a global hub for the Eurasian trade zone. And the U.S. is going to be left out in the cold.
That's very interesting, Jim. With the European banks and them buying up the government bonds of the European countries and that incestuous relationship, that's also why the bankers won't get prosecuted for any of their fraud or their financial crimes or or market manipulations and things like that. So, it's in exchange for funding these governments or at least in the short term, making it look like they're funding the governments, because the governments are buying the bonds back under the table. The central banks are, from the banks later on, that most people don't realize that that's how the system works. I think, you know, the European banks, eventually the Federal Reserve is going to have to step in if they're not already doing so with currency swaps. I actually have a funny story about that too. I tried to tell someone who had worked on Wall Street for a long time, and he considered himself a libertarian, about my currency swap story that I heard from the IMF. My source, who was there in 2014 at the meeting in Washington, D.C. about the currency swaps. And the guy was telling me, oh, currency swaps are only short-term loans. We hardly ever use them. They're always paid back immediately, so they're not a legitimate tool for liquidity and saving banks and governments. And then he sent me this link that he actually, I can't believe he believes this, but he's saying the Federal Reserve only has 22 million outstanding in currency swaps. I couldn't stop laughing when he actually sent me this link telling me that they only have 22 million outstanding in currency swaps, and he actually believed that.
Well, Jason, I believe in 2009 it was 2.3 trillion in dollar swaps made to the Euro Central Bank in order to prevent their banking system failure as a follow-on event to Lehman.
Yeah, and that was just a short-term one. You know, the Ron Paul one-time partial audit of the Federal Reserve said that over 19 trillion and during the 2008 crisis. And Jim Rickards now thinks we're over 30 trillion, and he's probably underestimating the number. So, I mean, there's none of these central banks are being audited, so we're only doing educated guesses here at this point. But, you know, when we see these press releases from these central banks with the ECB, with their asset purchase program, and the Bank of Japan with their new, you know, asset purchase program, or QE, and Bank of England's talking about a larger one, the Federal Reserve is going to have to step in. I mean, these things, we're getting into the trillions of dollars per year here, and that's just what they're putting out in the press releases. That's not the real number.
Jason, I'd like to add another trillion estimate of mine. We hear about how the Fed is involved with 40 or 50 billion dollars a month covering Treasury bonds, and they're long past covering the mortgage bonds. Then if you look to see the BRICS nation, you know, Belgium, Luxembourg, Ireland, Cayman, Switzerland, the European outposts are the exported QE. From mid-2012 to the end of 2014, the BRICS nations had $420 billion of treasuries that were purchased. Okay, there's a lot of hidden QE is my point. Here's what I believe is going on with the Fed. Because the petrodollars dismantled, the energy price went down. It has tremendous impact to the energy derivatives out there. And I believe the Fed is involved in somewhere between 20 and 50 trillion dollars per month in derivative patches. And they're not publicizing the figures. I think they're fixing a lot of holes, plugging them. We have all these different factors that undermine the derivatives, yet we have no derivative data to show on what the damage was. And the London whale, that has come out now finally to admit something like a $9 billion hole with respect to interest rate swap derivatives. The voice told me it's closer to 100 billion. Okay, so most of what they admit is 10 to 20 times larger in reality. And they're not admitting to anything with respect to the derivatives, while the Treasury bonds have gone haywire, while the energy market has gone to crap, and all the different connecting derivatives must have leveraged impact in the trillions. So what's holding it all together? I mean, they can't get away from fiat money, because if they have to come up with actual money to cover the debts that are related to the system, they don't have $800 trillion lying around. I mean, maybe.
Exactly.
I mean, I could go on and on. It's so absurdly broken. And I think we're going to get some events before the end of the year which make it rather clear that it's broken. I think what we're going to see is an interruption. Okay, this is not such an outrageous statement to make, but I believe that these 8 events to patch over the banking failures and bond failures overnight that happened with narco money. Okay, I'd like to relate to you just one little story. I might have told you this before, but Cato stepped on an elevator in September 2010, and he's a big fellow, and he kind of scared me. I jerked back, and he said, "Jimmy, I want you to check something with your man, The Voice. Bank of America just put out $13 billion of Bush narco money overnight to patch a hole so that BOA wouldn't do a failure. Will you check with your guy, The Voice?" So I thought, okay, this is a perfect chance to leave out information and see if The Voice fills in the blanks. So I contacted The Voice with an email. I said, a large Wall Street bank had a multi-billion-dollar hole last night, almost had a default event. It was Papa Bush, it was narco money, and Bank of America, and $13 billion. I'm sorry. I blew it. I told him a large Wall Street bank, a large narco element in the U.S. elite, and it was multi-billion. Do you have any further data to confirm this? And he wrote back and said, yeah, Bank of America, $13 billion, Papa Bush. So I left out the key data, Jason, and The Voice mentioned it all. Here's why I bring that up. In 2010, if one Bank of America event costs $13 billion, do you think it costs more now? I say, yeah, it probably costs $30 billion. If there were 8 of them, that would be $250 billion for 8 events and 8 patches. So here's my point. The narco boys are going to say, look, we worked hard in our narcotics and heroin monopoly. We built the Afghan vertical integration heroin business. We worked hard for our $800 billion a year in profit. We worked hard to expand our Bush family fund. It's called the Association for Past Presidents. It's worth about 6 or 7 trillion. They're not going to want it bled. And they're going to let the U.S. banking system go because they're not going to continue with 30 billion here, 30 billion there to patch things up when, as Cato confirmed to me 2 nights ago, the time between these failure events is shortening. So are they going to put out 30 billion every other night? No, they're going to get sick of this. Just like the Basel Bank for International Settlements is getting sick of putting out gold leases to prevent failures in the gold market. So the narco boys are going to stop the patchwork for bank failures while the Basel bankers are going to stop the patchwork for the gold market. And this is partly how you're going to see the failures happen.
Welcome to dystopia, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
Now I want to talk about gold. Jacob Rothschild recently came out in public and said he is very bullish on gold, and he's been adding more because of negative interest rates. Why do you think so many billionaires all over the globe are coming out and going on the record warning about the next looming financial crisis, getting out of stocks and bonds, and buying gold?
Well, they have a convenient excuse in negative interest rates. They know it's absurd. They know it's a last ditch. I call negative interest rates, Jason, breathing through your asshole. So how's the air quality there? Does that
stinky?
Does that breathing through your asshole? Can you do a 100-yard dash?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. So you've got QE wrecking capital while the bankers are forcing corporations to breathe through their assholes and produce oxygen. Last I checked, the rectum had no lungs. Okay, so Jacob Rothschild has a convenient excuse to say, I don't like negative interest rates, I'm all for gold. Instead, he could say, the global banking system is on its last legs. QE has destroyed the bond system. The banks are all insolvent. The Easterners have a solution called gold, and I'm jumping on board because I'm not going down with the ship in the West that I have been captain on. Does that sound like it makes sense?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense, but that's not exactly what he said.
I
Though.
don't care what he says. Since when is he going to tell you the truth? Did he tell you that he brought down the Ukrainian airliner? Did he tell you why he did?
Nope.
Did he tell you about the Freescale chip whose ownership he wanted? Because the real shareholders of the Freescale chip incorporation were on board that plane. Did he tell you why he killed all those people on board? No, he's not a truth merchant. He's a Satanist piece of scum.
Yeah, neither is his crony George Soros. Yeah.
Right. Well, they're getting exposed. And okay, I did a story. I think it was around April or May, of how Soros was beginning to invest in gold, and that was the headline story. And I read the next few paragraphs of the story, and I thought, he's not buying gold. He's buying Barrick stock, and he's buying the GLD fund, the Exchange Traded Fund for Gold. He's not buying gold. He's supporting all the fraudulent elements that prop up gold. Okay, and now I've heard in the last month that Soros sold out. Okay, so is there a planned decline in the gold and silver price before the Chinese gold-backed RMB has its launch in the next few months? That's what I think's coming. I don't care what these people say, Jason. I mean, I found it alarming that Rothschild was a main funding agent for the movie V. Remember V back in 2003, the guy with the mask and, hacked in and broke into the British Broadcast Center and the music system and blew up Big Ben? And you remember that movie? Okay, that was that was to expose the criminal elite in their control of the banks, the economy. They murdered. It was called the St. Mary Massacre. 70,000 children were poisoned to death from contaminated water, and they blamed the Islamics. Then they made it illegal to own the Quran. And one particular buddy of it was the character played by Nicole Portman, Natalie Portman. Sorry, Natalie Portman. He had a private Quran collection. Okay, so what they were doing is Jacob Rothschild was following the rules of engagement for Satanists. He was telling the victims, telling the public what he's going to do. And that is poison the population and incriminate the Islamics. And I saw a picture recently of Natalie Portman meeting Jacob Rothschild, and my God, she might as well have kissed his ring and gotten on one knee. You wouldn't find me doing that. I'd leave the room. Okay, it's called the rules of engagement. A pure satanic sacrifice tells the victim, here's where we want you to go. We want you to come here to celebrate. We have a party. And the victim comes willingly and doesn't realize he's on the altar of sacrifice. It's called the Satanist rules of engagement. They also have the celebration of fire every mid-April. And that's why Lincoln was killed in mid-April. The Waco, Texas was mid-April. Boston Marathon was mid-April. Aurora, Colorado was mid-April. I did a little probability check because once in a while I get a question from Rob Kirby. He knows I eat this stuff for dinner. But he said, Jim, we got these 20 events and 18 of them happen in April. What's the chance of that? Okay, well, it's like coin flips, but you got 11/12ths probability that it's not in April. And the probability is, I think I came up with something like, well, these 18 out of 20 and landing up in the April slot on your roulette wheel is one chance in 62 million. It's kind of proof through inference that the Satanists love April. I got lots of unusual things. It's not the centerpiece of my work, but When I noticed that George Soros was paying through his NGOs passage for the dirt poor Arabs to come to Western Europe on ships. I mean, they had these heart-wrenching pictures of people hanging on to the shipyard arms, and some of them dying because they couldn't hang on. They ended up in the water and they couldn't swim the whole way. And bodies. Anyway, I read up. I asked the question, these are dirt poor people. How do they get passage on a boat? And the answer was the Soros NGOs. And I concluded quickly, well, this is not a philanthropist. He's got a motive. So if this is August in 2015, I'm thinking in September, we're going to have a major terrorist event in a big city in Western Europe. And there it was, Paris, France, the next month. So they bring in thousands of Arabs, and 1 in 100 is a violent person who's trained in violence. And Facebook does their best with Zuckerberg. He does his best to shut down all the revelations, all the social networks in Europe that reveal how these people work and set up their organizations to commit the violence. So I wish nothing but the worst for Zuckerberg. Nothing but the worst. I hope he goes bankrupt. I hope he does tin cupping on the corner.
Yeah, well, these technological elites, they all seem to be, whether it's Facebook or Google or YouTube, well, YouTube's owned by Google now, but they all seem to be supporting Hillary Clinton and blocking, any of these videos or reducing the amount of views of the videos about like Hillary's health and the ones that are anti-Hillary Clinton now. So that's the new thing that they're trying to do. They're pulling out all the stops to try to rig the election to help Hillary. The mainstream media is doing a lot of it too. It's just nonstop anti-Trump. They won't say any of the truth about Hillary Clinton on there. I want to ask you though one more question about gold. Obviously the central banks and the Bank of International Settlements have tried to manipulate gold for a long time and slow its price increase, paper price increase, by manipulating the market with high frequency trading programs and so many other tricks. But now it's been revealed through the work of Louis Camersano over at Small Gold that the Swiss National Bank owns over $1 billion worth of gold and silver shares. Norway Central Bank, not their sovereign wealth fund, which invests their oil profits, but their central bank owns $1 billion worth of gold and silver too. Is this a way for them to hedge, to make some of the money back, so they manipulate the paper gold price and then make the money back on the gold stocks that are going up?
Well, I asked the question whether they own gold and silver bars or gold and silver mining shares.
Well, if they do own any bars, they're probably leased or swapped out. I know the Swiss National Bank, the amount of gold they own has declined a lot over the decades.
Okay, so you're referring to mining stock shares, right?
Yeah, they've been loading up since the bottom last year. The last year or so, they've been adding like crazy.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be surprised if they abandon their positions, because I wouldn't be at all surprised that there's a pounce coming. So like George Soros, who sold out of his paper instruments related to gold, I wouldn't be surprised if they do too. But whenever I hear stories like this, I tend to think the same way. This seems like a front door takeover of mine supply. If you followed the Grasberg, Indonesia incident, you'd learn that the government has been trying to do a fair auction in an open sale to the best bidders, and it's not going very well. The problem is not so much that they can't find adequate bidders. The problem is that the U.S. government is getting in there and murdering people. Okay. Grasberg, pardon me, Grasberg, for those who don't know, is probably the largest active gold mine in the world. It has like 20 different layers, the circular layers that are like 2 miles diameter for the trucks to go down, 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 and then come back up, up, up. There's a huge battle for the central banker cabal, which is often called the Khazarian Nazis. I prefer calling them the central banker cabal. There's a battle for them to own and control Grasberg. And the motive I hear is they want to own it and control it so they can make a new gold-backed currency system and have adequate gold supply to formulate the basis and foundation for the new currencies. And I then ask, are you talking about backing up all the sovereign debt? And they tend to always say the same things, these sources that I talk to. No, it's the new debt. The new debt would be gold-backed. So the Grasberg mine, if you put in that framework, would be to be used for covering new debt issuance, like $1 trillion for the U.S. government. $1 trillion is a lot of gold. That's like about 15,000, 17,000 tons. Okay, it's a lot of gold. And I don't think Grasberg has that much gold output in 1 year. So they're way off on the numbers. The quantity does not match the requirements. But what they could do is to have swaps on future output from Grasberg. There's a big battle going on with Grasberg. Now, related to Grasberg, and in that region, rather, there was a recent airplane flight. And I'm told, I don't want to tell my source, I'm told that it had 120 tons of gold on the aircraft. We're talking about a lot of weight. We're talking about 250,000 pounds on an aircraft. Okay, so it probably was something like a Hercules transport craft that could move tanks. Okay, what I'm hearing is that the airplane was downed and the gold was confiscated and it was headed to China. And I do not know for sure, can't get a confirmation, whether the gold went into the banker cabal evil hands. I'm of the mind that it was downed, but still the banker cabal did not get their hands on it. That the Chinese, how should I put it, players and actors in favor of the Chinese are still guarding it, but they can't get it to China. They can't move it and transport it to China. There's a battle, a huge battle going on for giant gold hoards, giant hoards of gold. And I think this is part of what's going on. You mentioned the Swiss National Bank and Norway National Bank, Central Bank. I don't really know what they're up to. But whenever I hear stories like that, I tend to think that they're trying to control the biggest of the gold producing mining companies so that they can control the major portion of gold mine output to devote it toward the new gold-backed system that will cover new marginal debt. Very important point. Not the total existing debt, but the new marginal produced, like U.S. government deficit. It's $1 trillion a year. They can lie all they want, but it's roughly $1 trillion a year. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I tend to think that if you own a nice little gold or silver company and own stock for it, it might get bought out by Barrick, which is the most evil of all the mining companies. It might get bought out by another giant like Newmont, which just can't seem to make final their merger with Barrick. And I think the problem with the Newmont and Barrick merger is real simple. The disclosure, that phase is just too ugly. Newmont gets in there and they look at the disclosure from like the Evergreen and other scummy little projects done by Barrick, and they say, no, we don't want to have anything to do with this. We're out. So if you own a nice little mid-size mining company, you might find that you're soon the owner of Newmont or Barrick mining shares because they just acquired you. It's the same old thing. The biggest take over, the biggest get the big funding, the biggest firms get the dirty money funding. I've been wondering when is some of the Bush narcotics money going to enter into Barrick? And they go on a massive acquisition spree. And the biggest question is going to be, where's Barrick getting all the money? Because they're not doing any secondary stock issuances. The last ones that they did were to cover the fines and to cover the debt from, I can't remember the name of that Chile, Argentina, Pascua Lama. They tried to cover the debt for that, and they do other, I think it was 2007 or 6, Barrick did a fraudulent stock issuance where they said we want to cover up our hedge book and get rid of it. And they didn't even cover a third of it. They lied. So they tried to do the same thing 4 years later, and the stock issuance fell on its face because they were exposed as liars and fraud kings. Now, there's so much dirty stuff going on with mining firms. I decided back in '08 I want to have nothing to do with them. And I've got some clients who say, what mining companies do you like? I say, well, I like these, but I don't recommend buying any of them. I recommend buying bars and coins for gold and silver. And I got some really good reasons why I don't like the mining companies. I think they're loaded with stock share dilution, which is their own unique method of inflation. They cover the next project with a huge 20% stock dilution. Suddenly the shares are freed up and the investors can sell, and whoops, there goes the stock price. So every several months you have another issuance. Every several months you have another free up and the sale of the stock. Stock never goes up. Meanwhile, any company at all doing business in Mexico is lying through their teeth about the theft of mine output, gold and silver, at the mine sites by the Zeta drug cartel. I know this straight from the horse's mouth. One of my buddies was on a mission to see and inspect a mine in Mexico. They got stopped because their black SUV fit the description of a rival gang captain. My friend had his neck with a boot on it in the Mexican dirt. He thought he was going to be killed. He wasn't killed. They had a Spanish-speaking fellow accompany them in that company limousine or company SUV. And he came back and told me, Jim, I got private inside scoop for this company, which I will not name, that they had about a 20% theft of their mine output. And so do a lot of companies down there, all by the Zetas, the Zeta cartel. So they're lying about their output, diluting their shares, and lots of other problems. I don't want to have anything to do with the mining shares. I wasted too many years with them from 2001 to 2007. Sure, you have some big winners. Yeah, my buddy had a big winner in Polytech, Minnesota mine area that hired Stanford metallurgical engineers to separate lots of difficult alloy so they could, produce the platinum, produce the silver, produce the copper, separate all this metal that's basically fused together. Yeah, and he had a 250 to 1 return on his investment. But as he told me later, Jim, I had, 18 or 19 failures out of 20. So one big winner covered the losses for that. I don't want to have anything to do with investment like that. I don't want to have exposure to bond fraud, share fraud, exposure to accounting fraud, exposure to stock option loaded on, exposure to new projects and the shares coming freed and sold out without any great warning. No, buy your gold and silver bars and coins and wait these sons of bitches out.
Now, Jim, I think for the last couple of questions, we've already covered how you think the global economic system reset's going to look like. Will you be purchasing a Hillary for Prison t-shirt before the November election?
No, I don't buy any of that stuff. I just watch. And I got a few stories for you. I had a client in Texas. I think their primary was April. They were part of the Super Tuesday or whatever. I don't know. It was in the spring, the Texas primary, and he wrote me and said, Jim, I'm in a smaller city in Texas. I don't know what the city was. He didn't name it. But he said there was a whistle stop tour where Hillary came to town. And not necessarily on a train, it was on a bus. And he said, it was amazing. I went there. I didn't go there to cheer on Hillary. I went there to be a witness to the bullshit story that would be told about her trip to our little city. And he said, what I found and saw was amazing. There were 7 people who turned out. She was expecting thousands. 7 people were outnumbered by her 9 Secret Service people. And she did not give a speech. She basically told them all, thanks for showing up. We've got another engagement. So she took off. Okay. Now you have the smartphones and the technology for them exposing Hillary, who's using green room background, to falsify videos of her giving a speech in this or that city. So we see her leaning forward and talking to people on stage, while the smartphones that are directed at the podium are showing a blank, empty stage. So she's falsifying her campaign appearances. And I'm a statistician. Way back in February and January, I'd be reading about the polls. And I noticed something remarkable, that the difference between 2 polls was way too big. If you have accurate random sample type polls, the Hillary percentage should be pretty tight for all of them. And they weren't. They weren't even remotely close. Some of them were 15% different, which means that the difference between the 2 polls and if you've got a plus or minus 2.5%, let's just say plus or minus 3% for some easy math, 95% confidence interval plus or minus 3% on Hillary's 18%. And another one says plus or minus 3%, 95% confidence on Hillary's 37%. 18 versus 37. Wow, that's a 19% difference. But you have a 3% confidence interval. Wait a minute. The difference between 2 percentage estimates would have a confidence interval of square root of 2 times the 3%, which would come to a little bit above 4, like 4.25%. Well, if that's the case, you've got a 19% difference between 2 polls and a 4.25% confidence interval at 95%. Well, gee, does that not translate to something like 4 times what the confidence interval would dictate? In other words, it smashes the integrity and legitimacy of the claimed polls. And what I've heard was that several polls were tilting their entire sampling process toward the Democrat and the woman vote. There are plenty of women out there who don't care that Hillary's a murderer, that don't care that Hillary is involved in treason, that don't care that she was influence peddling. They want a woman president. It's testimony to the stupidity of the American electorate who voted for a black man even though he was not an Afro-American black man. My website manager is black. Her name is Donna. She's a fine woman. I met her in my last job. She recommended that I start a website. She's partly responsible for, things going so well. She said, just investigate this. Maybe you should do a newsletter if you like writing. So I did. But here's the point about Donna. She's a member of a Western Pennsylvania and Ohio Black Chamber of Commerce. And she told me about 2 years ago, Jim, it's amazing. I don't know any black folk in this chamber who like Obama anymore. They think he's a turncoat. They think he's a fraud. They think he's not what he appears to be. And I said, I could have told you that in '08. And she said, yeah, well, I didn't believe it. I was hoping for the best, you know, change you can believe in. I said, right, change you can believe in. Just different methods of fraud and murder that you can believe in for sustaining the system. And she said, yeah, well, you know, you have a way of putting things. My point is, people were betrayed in voting for a black man. Now they're going to be betrayed if they try to vote for a woman. This is not a typical woman. This is a Satanist and a murderer. There are 6 dead people just since May of people who were coming forward, like the Democrat National Committee, like the United Nations official. They were ready to do testimony, and they're dead, and they're all declared suicide victims. The United States political arena has the highest suicide rate in the world. It's 50 times the national average. It's called murder. So we got rigged elections. The Patriot Act and other related acts make it illegal to question the inner workings of the machinery. I mean, I got a favorite story, probably told it before. Got a friend who lives in Germantown district of Philadelphia. Here it was, November of '04 for the re-election of Baby Bush. And my friend volunteered in Germantown to be a monitor at his district for the machines. They all got there half an hour early, 7 in the morning. Several of them, I think about 6 or 8 of the people, and they noticed all the machines were set 500 votes for Bush and 0 for Kerry. We have voter election fraud, people. We have rigged polls. They did tricks so that Hillary would win California primary by disallowing hundreds of thousands of Bernie Sanders votes. I don't know the details, but they disallowed the votes. Who disallowed the votes? The Obama people disallowed the votes. Obama shipped in several 100,000 Somalis into Ohio to vote for Obama, even though they weren't citizens or registered voters. Okay, the Clinton Foundation is the nexus for U.S. government corruption that links at least 20 different official offices. Probably involves 200 to 300 people. And you wonder, why didn't Comey, the head of the FBI, declare this worthy of indictment and proceed on the prosecution against Hillary? Because Comey was handpicked to be the FBI director after serving as chief counsel at HSBC in London, where one of his main projects was to make sure that the Narco money was all handled properly. They're all dirty, Jason.
Yeah, I agree. And Lois Lerner was handpicked to be in the IRS to protect the Clinton Foundation from being audited or investigated for over a decade as well.
If you take a look at any principal player who was not murdered, who had a voice in the cover-up, you'll see a player who's involved somewhere in the chain of command and in the array of the fraudulent offices. Comey is from HSBC legal staff. He was a chief counsel there. You don't have to do a lot of digging to see this. So what it means to me is that the Clinton Foundation will not be exposed unless and until the U.S. government debt defaults. They'll bring down the whole system.
Yeah, they don't care about the long term. They don't care about most people. Hillary pretends to care. She's good in front of the camera. As soon as the camera comes off, she treats almost everyone around her like shit. There's books out about this, you know, the Secret Service books, how badly she treats people, how she throws things at them. I think one of the Secret Service agents, she even like assaulted the guy with a Bible. She hurt the guy pretty badly. So she's a monster. She's really, really sick now too. She has symptoms of maybe Parkinson's. I've watched videos on this from doctors with Dr. Drew and other doctors commenting. So the medication she's on is very serious with a lot of side effects. The new medication the medication she's on old medication because the new medication they tried and it doesn't work. So she's on 1950s or 60s medication with really nasty side effects that no doctor in his right mind would use unless things were dire. So yeah, I think
I've got a comment on that regarding the actual diagnosis, if you don't mind.
Sure. Dr. Jim.
Well, I learned this from some medical friends of mine, and I used to do a lot of reading about cancer. What I've learned is to protect the reputation of a dead person and to protect the family from embarrassment. When the person has AIDS and HIV, they call it cancer. He died of cancer. Most recent example of that is David Bowie. He died of cancer. He died of heart ailments. Are you sure he didn't die of AIDS? Because he was a pretty skinny guy. All right, now we hear that Hillary has Parkinson's. Could she instead have syphilis? Could she have AIDS and HIV and be under, really good medication so she doesn't lose weight? Kind of like Magic Johnson doesn't lose weight. But does she have syphilis from way too much sexual perversion with Bill? And maybe way too much drinking of blood and urine at Satanist sacrifices? Blood, wine, and urine. It has nasty side effects, the urine. Okay, I don't believe Hillary has Parkinson's. And why is that? Because the mainstream news said so. I think she has something much uglier. I've got a contact in the U.S. government who told me that Bill Clinton has a fatal brain disease. And I said, what, syphilis? And he said, very possibly, but maybe something like that, or chlamydia. And I said, well, can't they treat it? And he said, it might just be too far along. It might have been denied in years past, so it wasn't properly treated. And I said, do you think it could be HIV? And he said, possibly. Are some of the symptoms that we're seeing in the Clinton diabolical duo, are they consistent with HIV? That's what I look at. I think we might possibly have the first HIV president.
That's very interesting. Well, no matter what they both have, we're not being told the truth. And the mainstream media, if you bring it up, you can lose your job. You can get fired. My friend David Seaman, who I've interviewed a couple 4 or 5 months ago, he actually wrote an article. He was a Huffington Post contributor, and as soon as he wrote an article about Hillary Clinton's health, they fired him immediately. So right. I mean, they're just trying to bury every single out, and it was a top story on Zero Hedge too. So thankfully, he was able, I guess, to get another job. But they're the propaganda. I mean, they're not even trying to hide that they're doing propaganda anymore. It's just the world now that we're in is just totally dystopian.
Well, it is, and take a look at this sequence. You had falsified polls. You have falsified campaigning, stages that don't have any people on them. You have falsified primaries. You have falsified voting machines. And you remember the earpiece? I mean, they couldn't make it a white earpiece for Obama. They made it a brown one. Remember remember Baby Bush had the oversized element in his back and upper shoulder? That was his monitor so that somebody could tell him what to say during the debates because he's just so effing dumb. Okay, Obama had a prompt also. He's the teleprompting president. When the teleprompter goes off, he has no idea what to say. Okay, so all these elements, including the debates, have falsified portions. I don't think Hillary needs a whole lot of coaching because she's a blabbermouth and a pseudo-intellect from Wellesley College. And I have a woman who I actually dated in 2001, and she told me I was I went to Wellesley College. I said, wait a minute, were you there? You're roughly the same age. Were you there with Hillary? She said, oh, yeah. Flaming lesbian. She had 20 girlfriends. She was in the same dormitory as Hillary Rodham. Okay, but here's what I'm leading to, Jason. I think we're going to see something that cannot be faked, and that is the physical reaction and the verbal responses that Hillary is going to come up with. She's going to obviously have her coaching and have the tapes, you know, running in her head. Okay, oh, answer topic A or topic C or topic F. Okay, here's your answer. But once she wanders and once she faces the Donald Trump intellect, he's going to destroy her on the debating. And it comes up, I believe, in 3 weeks, the first one. Watch her totally fail. And if she doesn't totally fail, watch her make significant errors in ways that are not recoverable. And then they're going to have a hard time with the polls. Because the polls that I'm reading, the fair kinds of polls, and some of them have their own bias toward people who have smartphones and people who use online devices. And my father doesn't. He's a dinosaur. He's in his 80s. Okay, all the different polls that I read about that are based on pretty good attempts at random sampling show that Trump has about a 30% lead.
Yeah, and he's killing her on social media too. I mean, there's just so much more support. The Trump rallies are a lot bigger. I'm really excited to see the debate, so I think it's going to be very interesting reality TV. I'm wondering if she might actually, you know, pass out and have a seizure during the debate. If Trump, you know, says a really good one-liner zinger, she might just lose it.
Well, maybe they'll fake an assassination attempt.
Well, the scary thing, Jim, is the mainstream media. A lot of people, New York Times, Rolling Stone writers have been calling for that done to Donald Trump. So we live in an era where, you know, if you're on one party or you're in an independent party where the main party, the Democratic Party, who controls the mainstream media now, other than Fox News, you know, they could just go after you and openly call to take you out.
Maybe they'll claim Donald Trump poisoned her. Maybe they'll fake an assassination attempt. I'm repeating myself. This is what I think might happen. She collapses on stage and it's all Trump's fault. It's Trump's people who poisoned her before they poisoned her water at her hotel room before the debate. I think they're going to set up Trump as a scapegoat for something that happens. This is how these Nazis work. They don't give up power. They'll destroy the entire system before they give up power.
Yeah, and we're seeing many different examples of this, you know, with the Brexit vote, the way it turned out. And, you know, the lawyers in Brussels, and there's so many lawsuits now that the Brexit might not even fully go through. It's tied up in the courts for years at least now before anything actually happens.
Well, we'll see. I think it's going to be moving quite along rapidly, and I think it's going to get some elite sponsorship that we don't expect because it's all part of a plan. What I find fascinating right now is the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership trade union sponsored by the fascist Obama administration. This is a giant fascist power grab and trade union. It has corporations owning everything. Corporations involved as being in charge of all conflict resolution, owning intellectual property, owning assets and you know, like tangible property like mines and ports.
Yep.
We have a fascinating phenomenon going on right now where the individual nations are all rejecting the TTIP, but the European Union commissions is saying, no, everything's on schedule. Everything's moving along swimmingly. Okay.
Yeah, these guys Yeah, these guys are bought and paid for. And Obama is also starting, once he leaves the presidency, he's also starting his own Obama Foundation. It's set up, Jim. I talked to Charles Ortell about this. People can go listen to my interview from last month. He said it's set up very similar to how the Clinton Foundation is set up. So Obama's going to be getting all this slush fund money, not pay taxes on it, using it for bribes or whatever. These are how these guys, they set up a foundation now, and they don't pay taxes on it. So
never going to happen.
Yep.
Never going to happen. Obama Foundation cannot compete with the monopoly called the Clinton Foundation. The Clinton Foundation will not tolerate the Obama Foundation. They will destroy it. Never going to happen. Monopolies within fascist systems never have competition. Never going to happen, Jason. If anything, Obama will work out some kind of influence peddling bullshit organization to handle fascist power grabs in Africa.
Yeah, that's an interesting theory. Well, Jim, I want to thank you for your time today. If our listeners want to find your work at the Hat Trick Letter or goldenjackass.com, how do they do so?
Well, it's www.goldenjackass.com. There's a free page there, a lot of interviews, some public articles. I try to keep it current. There's a new phenomenon that's going on lately, Jason, and I don't really know what quite is happening, but different YouTube portions are being taken from my past interviews, like from 6 months ago, and they're posted anew, and they don't have my authorization. It's a kind of a nice insulting compliment, but it's like they're starving for jackass interview content out there. I don't know who's doing it, but what I try to do is on my main web page, the public domain web page, no password required. I maintain the best of my ability with current interviews and their links and the most recent public articles. But if you want to look at the most recent interviews, go to my main HTML web page on goldenjackass.com, and you'll see this Jason Borak interview posted. And it's posted on September 1st. Well, the date of the interview is September 1st, and it'll be posted shortly after. I made a promise to a client of mine. I said, in the beginning of the interview, I'm going to try to mention the date, but here on the end, I'm mentioning September 1. This is the date for the interview. Okay, I try to keep the links current. I try to keep a list of upcoming interviews and a short list of interviews that are completed but not yet posted. People are actually writing to me and say, Jim, I don't understand. You got an interview from months and months ago, and it just got posted. Why don't you keep a list? I said, I do. Go to the goldenjackass.com, look at the main page, and see the most recent interviews. But the main purpose of these interviews is promotional. It's also to do, as my father called it, missionary work. I want people to wake up. I want people to realize that our country is being sabotaged. Our country, ever since 2001, has been gutted and waylaid and wasted by the fascist business model. This Hillary election could be the final piece to it. But I want people to sign up for the Hat Trick Letter, which was started in April of 2004, labor of love, in our 13th year here now. And I'm very happy to say that for the last 5 or 6 years, I've had a team. It's not my staff. It's a team of colleagues. We have a lot of mutual respect for each other. There's hardly ever a big argument. There might be a debate. We had a debate recently on whether silver is going to rise up as much as gold. And one fellow says, I don't think so. And the rest of us all say, yes, it will, including the voice. So he's not exactly shouted down. He's just a smaller voice that, not even a small voice. He's one voice that's not seeing anybody join him. Okay, so for the last several years, I've got these, it's 10 men, and they come from all over the place. 2 are from London, one's from Central Europe, one's from Canada, Rob Kirby, and we got a few Americans. So it's very interesting. It's a lot of fun. This is very stimulating work. And I hope people sign up for the hat trick letter, because this is history being made. This is the king dollar and its reign of terror coming to an end. This is the demise of the petrodollar set up by Kissinger in 1974, where he suggested that the Arabs do an oil embargo and quadruple the oil price. That was a Rockefeller plan, not a Saudi plan. So we're being wrecked by the Rockefeller Foundation. And there's basically a Clinton, Bush, Rockefeller alliance that's all evil, all satanic, and they've pretty much completed their wreckage of the United States. But I think it's going to come back like a phoenix after we have the gold standard imposed, but with a big, big wrinkle, Jason, and this is sad. Because of all of our debt and foreign held debt, we're going to have to endure a foreign colonization. And it's going to be largely Chinese, but also European and British. After the new dollar is launched, there's going to be an invitation for capital formation and development of new companies in the United States, so that we could put people back to work, but more importantly, so we can bring down the $500 billion trade deficit. Because if we don't bring it down, the new currency is going to go the way of Venezuela.
Well, we have serfdom now, so hopefully the next global financial system is better than that, where you know, people get into enormous amounts of debt for a shitty job that they have to work to pay off bills just to keep their heads above water.
I think what you're going to see in 5 years, 4 years, 3 years is people saying, I'm glad to have a job. I'm not making the kind of money I used to, but I've got a job. I don't have the fringe benefits that I used to. And my manager is Chinese.
Well, I mean, America was originally a nation of immigrants, so we'll see what happens. Thank you again for your time, Jim, and we'll have you on again in the next 3 or 4 months.
Okay. All right. Thanks for having me.